we're back. Yeah, I hope everyone has a nice lunch break, maybe breakfast, maybe you're at dinner right now. But for us here in Germany, it's lunchtime. And to have, let's say, a little bit of a different food here, we already brought a nice cake. I hope everyone can see this. So yeah, we got here something. And we will also maybe start eating it already. But in the meantime, I think we start with a nice question for everyone to answer. And please, audience, help us here. Also bring your questions. We are eager to hear it. And the question I have is, what would you say is the most difficult part convincing people to do micro frontends? Michael.
It's interesting. So usually I don't try to convince people to use micro frontends. So
just do.
No. When people come to me and say they have a problem, where they talk to me, oftentimes they talk to me because they know I do something with micro frontends. But I've seen many cases where people had issues, but their issues were other issues and not something you can solve with micro frontends. So I would guess when you go micro frontends, you have to prove that decoupling the application in order to gain more speed, in order to develop independently, this does justify the complexity you get when adopting a micro frontends architecture. This does not really answer the question, but I tried not to convince people, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's not always about convincing, sometimes about convincing them not to use it. It really depends on your application, on your requirements, on what you're building, in what is your organization setup, how many teams are developing this, does the user navigate often between different applications. And I think if the complexity in the domain business logic is high, and you have a lot of domains, it might be justified then to say, let's do micro frontends, but then you need to be really clear about architecture upfront to separate those domains, that the needed context handover is kept at a minimum and that everything works.
My side, on top of what we have said today, I would add also the most difficult part, especially if the, let's say, request to move into micro frontends is bottom up, so it's coming from developers and staff engineers, lead developers, etc. I think the big challenge for them, or what I've seen, is translating technical metrics into business metrics. So the fact that so if you have to sell to your C-suite how beneficial would be the usage of micro frontends, it's the fact that you say, oh yeah, now my I don't know, CI, CD, or my automation pipeline takes from 50 minutes to 3. That's not enough. So what is, let's say, what is the translation of these 3 minutes to how many, I don't know, features you can deploy in production, how many tests you can do in production, how, let's say, finding a metric that it makes the company sensible about the topic. I think that is by far the most difficult challenge that I've seen teams struggling with.
Nice.
For you, Florian? Don't escape the question.
I think all answers are good, and I share the sentiment. So what I would also add is that there is, many people have been burned by microservices, and one of the problems is that we live in a world where attention spans are short and presentations are very good. So I mean, you look today, presentations of Microsoft, Apple, and everyone, of course, also has the same tooling and access to these nice talks. And so you get a lot of shiny things these days. And so we are always in this hype-driven cycle where people are no longer really, as they should, in my opinion, ask, does it make sense for me? What's the context? But they just follow it. And they did, of course, with microservices. And very often that was wrong, maybe because it wasn't a good solution for the problem. Maybe the people also were not really used to it. They also didn't spend the amount of time you need to come up with something, a setup then that works with this technology that we are now trying to use. And so they're very hesitant to use micro frontends. of course, they should still think about the right context, but in my opinion, very often the context is more or less ideal. And then there's still and that, of course, might be also management side, would say another set of development, but it's also from the developers to say, oh, now changing there, that won't solve a thing. And we also want to go to the latest version of Angular or whatnot. And what can we do here? So in my opinion, this really overcoming this being burned maybe by some other hype cycle and really trying to understand what's the problem. That's for me the most challenging part, I would say, overcoming that.
Fair.
But maybe someone in the audience also has a take on that. In the meantime, while we wait, I would distribute the cake. Because I'm always looking at the cake. I have like a perfect angle. It's like to the camera. And I think everyone here on the first round of answers earned a piece of the cake. So like a puzzle, we're now doing reverse, right? It was already set together, but now it will be taken apart. I think
we won't recompose it later.
Yes.
This looks
Yeah. First one didn't go well,
good.
guys.
I take that because
No one saw that.
it dropped, right? And it might be anyway too massive. So you tell me, you see already the, let's call it now the vertical. Tell me the horizontal here. Is it
I would like the mic because Michael.
Okay, so
Yeah.
this is a large one.
That's very smart.
Okay, so hopefully this time it will go better. So great. So Cathrin,
Yeah, it's okay.
It's okay, but still, this is many layers, as you expect in a well-done application. And enjoy. You will also get a fork, and you get the puzzle pieces. And I think that
The
also
puzzle piece is
Yeah.
perfect. I always dreamed
Now
for
let's
puzzle
make it
pieces.
3 of 3. Perfect.
Thank you.
Self-contained cakes.
Let's distribute the forks.
Thank you very much.
Enjoy life. Start with dessert. Okay. In the meantime, I don't see any more questions, so that's why I now have one left. Just looking out there in teams you've worked with, what is the thing that they struggled with most on the technical side? Because process-wise, I mean, we talk a lot about that, and process-wise, I think there are many things they're struggling with, and that is, of course, then fully company-specific. But maybe technically, we can find something where we say this is where we've seen these teams struggling with. Luca, maybe you start on your side.
I think the biggest offenders, I would say, are definitely server-side rendering. I think there the community has still work to do in order to make it slicker. I think the challenge that involves, obviously, so it depends from let's say, obviously, who is the target audience, because if you think about that, when you move into the server-side rendering part, you might have developers that maybe are Java developers, and they have to do like some micro frontends, so they want to do some micro frontends, but they don't have skills on the front end. Therefore, a solution like HTMX could be a fantastic approach for them because it's very close to what they are used to. At the same time, when you have like full stack developers that are closer to the front end side, dealing with all the containers or serverless or whatever other compute approach you're going to take, it might or might not be an easy task, because on top of compute, then you think about all the rest, networking part, the security part. So it's stuff that are often over their heads, and therefore, unless you have like a strong team that is simplifying, a strong platform team that is simplifying the work for you, then you might risk that is not getting as slick as possible. So I think that is definitely one of the main challenges I've seen. And probably the second one on the technical side is, especially for teams that are approaching for the first time micro frontends, is that there is this confusion between components and micro frontends. Because very often the idea of I use the same mindset of before, but now instead of using a library, I'm composing a runtime, is still too much spread across the trenches.
Yeah. So just as a follow-up question before we come to you two, so one of the challenges I heard or that I see on the server side is that there you can't just assume that, for instance, there's JavaScript, right?
Yeah.
So, which means you're potentially on your own. Of course, for Node.js, there are some solutions, and we got, for instance, the now abandoned Taylor project, which was Java-based. But then again, there's, I mean, good luck having your programming language with that framework that you're using on the server being covered, right? So you just need to start from scratch, and then all the other problems come on top of it, right? And
I think though, for all the communities that are not JavaScript based, there is still a good path forward. I think leveraging HTML fragment exchange, like at the beginning when we started with Zalando doing that, it's not a bad idea at all, because it's quite safe compared to other approaches. And now I think HTMX can help a lot, because if you think about server-side rendering, the idea of going every time to the server in order to render a page is normal. And HTMX is using these hyper-driven development where you always pass through link after link to the server. Therefore, there is also, I played quite a bit with the HTMX in order to see how it will pan out in the Micro Frontends world. And it's interesting that, for instance, the similar concept of React server components is implemented also there. So if you want to atomically update a portion of the UI, you will be able to, like Highland architecture or React server components, stuff like that. So that I think is very interesting also for companies that are using other technologies that are not nodes related, and even integration with WebSocket or server-side events is, let's say, extremely easy with HTMX, that I tried immediately because I found a very cool approach for updating a real time a specific portion of the UI. So I believe there is a lot to play with, and again, I think we have a mission as community also to make for these kind of communities that maybe, if you want, not so close like JavaScript, a very nice and welcoming environment for them, because I believe they have a lot to contribute to this community.
Nice. Cathrin?
Yeah, I think it's going in a similar direction. Many teams within the last few years are so accustomed to using SPA frameworks. So since 2016, the rise of the SPA frameworks with Angular and React, many developers do not know what's going on under the hood in vanilla HTML and vanilla JavaScript, and what are the specialities of the browser itself. And this way, really, there needs to be a mindset shift, that the teams are aware what they are used to developing will not work anymore in a micro frontend world, and we have to reinvent something from scratch that's given in a SPA framework. And really, the most problematic things is around state management. How do we share state? How do we communicate and not depend on what we are used to having, the SPA, the state framework, and yeah, that's the biggest challenge, I would say. And not to violate, not to do dirty hacks, like, for example, if for security reason it's not allowed to store something in the browser, session storage, local storage, that the teams do not find a way to define some global window variable. To get the mindset to ask, hey, we need something to get transported, and let's define a global, reliable, secure mechanism to transport that.
Yeah. So the question was technical issues people have when implementing Micro Frontends. So I guess one thing I've observed a lot of times was that oftentimes front-end frameworks, front-end libraries have the concept of single and global scope, whatever, and are built with the assumption that they are they own the complete page. When these libraries started, they were quite simple, and there was not a big problem, I guess. But the abstraction goes higher and higher right now. So we have Next framework. There's a lot of assumption that the complete application manages the header and other stuff. And you, in your talk, talked about modifying the history with Angular router, for example. And these problems are really hard to debug, because you find out that two things operate on the same concept. In most of the cases, it's fine, and then you get into scenarios where things break. You don't understand. People that are not skilled in debugging or reading or understanding these libraries, which are quite complex, depending on what you pick. It's a really hard problem. So I guess many of the frameworks have discovered or noticed that micro frontends is a thing, and providing the ability to having multiple instances of the same framework, maybe different versions on the same page, is something that must be supported from the Quick framework. They have a dedicated micro frontends page in their documentation where they're talking about this topic and what works, what does not work. And I guess I would wish that more and more applications or more and more frameworks would be built or would take this as a concept inside of their development, so that they support multiple instances on the same page.
Yeah, what I think apart from the code is also a challenge and really a scary area to discover is how is an application bundled or built or compiled. Not many people know what Angular or so do under the hood with TypeScript compiler, with Webpack bundling and so on. And as soon as anything has to be changed here in how this is compiled, bundled and packaged, problems arise.
Yeah, dependencies, right? It's you need them, but they bring a lot of problems. We also got some questions in the chat, so let's maybe go with them one by one. The first one from Robson: is there any need to manage microfrontend versions independent from their backends? Anyone has an opinion on that?
Yeah, just the opinion that if you build your microfrontend and your microservice independently, you have to be very, very careful in backwards compatibility. And what do you increase first? Do you increase first the backend version, deploy a new backend, and how is this organized? So ideally, you have a microfrontend consisting of frontend and backend versionized together to make sure the APIs match.
For rollbacks, I think that would make the most sense.
Yeah, it's not always possible though, because if you think about GraphQL, then you start to open up a big can of worms, because now that graph, so they work with usually schema federation, therefore that graph is unique, that you like or not, and therefore, and even when you have like, for instance, my previous company, we had to target 45, 50 different different frontends with different languages. And therefore, we couldn't align one backend team with one frontend team, because otherwise we create a first-class citizen on one target but not the others. And therefore, API versioning was a thing, and you need to deal with backward compatible APIs for a while. But you need also, the other thing that we learned in the hard way was that you need to have a strategy for decommission old version, because especially if you have like mobile application and web, the adoption of a new version on mobile is definitely slower than one on web. So web is immediate, but on mobile it could take a month before everyone is on the latest version. So therefore you need to have a mechanism that enables you to do a force upgrade on the front end when needed, in order to, let's say, not go crazy with the backward compatibility.
But when you don't have this complex requirements, when you're building a web application, I would highly suggest to align front and back end development and have one pipeline. If you can, yes, of course. It always depends, as we discussed yesterday.
Yeah. But this is also coming from the trend that you separate the front end and back end team. I've been working in full stack teams, domain relevant full stack teams, and this makes your life a whole lot easier. Also to make it understandable. What do I need to make backwards compatible, and to have some testing awareness of your domain with complete backend and frontend.
Yeah, this is one of the best parts of micro frontends, that you can now have these full stack teams, and not only, of course, stopping at development, but also maybe a designer there, some guy who knows about the business, and so therefore having everything covered, that you're really fully autonomous, right? Then you have one if you're there. But unfortunately, not always possible.
But even if you are able to create self-contained system, front and back end, with all the disciplines in there, you still have this runtime mismatch. So having an API that's deployed to a server that sits in a data center, and then having a single page application in the front end that is not updated, you can force update it, but maybe you don't want to force update it. And the API when the API is updated, so you still in these scenarios have to think about making API changes non-breaking to at least support the previous version that was deployed, whatever. So in the projects I've worked on, we had some kind of agreement or rule that when we do breaking changes, that we keep them along for 1 day or 3 days time frame, where we can consider all users to have reloaded by now, for example.
That is needed. Great. Let's pick the next one because I think it fits rather nicely in if we covered the previous one. So this is Lava is asking, what is your opinion on deploying the shell and a bunch of microfrontends to be built and deployed in one Docker image and each repository in a separate Docker image? So essentially already going into the direction of we deploy something, and as a unit of deployment, we have here Docker image.
So the question is if you have like application shell bundle, so deployed alongside with the Micro Frontends in the same
essentially what I understand here is a mix of one is a build time composition and the other is then runtime composition, and I think the cut is then maybe on, let's call it a core layer of Micro Frontends. They may be developed in a monorepo, and then you have maybe other teams developing not so essential Micro Frontends in other repos. So at least that's how I understand it as a unit of deployment they're using here, Docker.
Yeah, I mean, the advantage of deploying everything as a build time composition is that you can test it upfront and not realize the exceptions at runtime. And the downside is if one of the Micro Frontends needs often updates or versioning updates or whatever, you don't want to build the whole bundle again only for this Micro Frontend. So it always depends how many times you have updates, how many dependencies, shared, versionized libraries you have. But you can have a mix. You can have a shell application, many build time libraries in there, and maybe 1 or 2 module federated or web component injected Micro Frontends.
All right. Maybe then this goes into a direction also to see some of these things in practical use. David is asking, I'm interested to hear about some of the largest platforms or sites or applications that the group has worked on. So large in terms of, for instance, traffic or number of users, maybe also, I don't know, lines of code or something. Luca, I mean, you worked from New Zealand to Silicon Valley.
So the one that I worked the most from scratch was the Zone. Or the idea is N or dozen. There are plenty of ways to say that. And that was a platform that has huge spikes of traffic. So we moved from tens of thousands users in the platform a few minutes before a live match, like imagine like the Champions League final. We moved to a couple of million users in a minute or so. And therefore, everything has to scale for that specific minute. That was the challenge that you have when you deal with live. But then after that, I followed quite a few other customers, a few public references that I think we can mention. Is, for instance, PayPal did quite a few talks about Micro Frontends, and if you go to the web application, they're using Micro Frontends. It's been a while that they're doing that, and they're doing successfully. That is a fantastic testimony. Here in Germany, we have another big brand that is Adidas. That deliver a few talks about Micro Frontends. They use like a vanilla implementation, if I remember well. They're not using any framework, but also for them, let's say if you think about the e-commerce, how much traffic they have, it's crazy. There is in UK, for instance, there is an e-commerce called The Nelm that raising popularity during pandemic a lot, and they're using server-side rendering Micro Frontends. So, and obviously when there are, let's say, high traffic and there is like Black Friday or stuff like that, they scale very nicely with that. So I think nowadays the problem of finding references is definitely less than an issue compared to a few years back. Now I think many companies are embracing, even Netflix, like they released Lattice, I think it's called, the framework. So there are plenty of companies using that without any problem. So yeah.
Anything to add?
So the German e-commerce example.
Yeah.
So this
Exactly.
is our business domain. So we have a lot of experience with e-commerce platforms. But since I'm not the DevOps guy, and auto scaling usually works
Out of
in
the
the
box.
project.
Yeah.
So I can't give real numbers, but it's definitely an area where you get a call when things don't work and when things don't scale properly because they can calculate how many minutes offline relates to how many euros in conversion, for example. And I guess being able to split and doing this micro frontends architecture there, so having a lot of traffic on the catalog pages, for example, and then only this team has to make sure that the search is running smoothly, for example. This also helps compared with how we did it back in the days when we had a monolith and it was not possible to just spin up 10 of these giant monolithic applications, for example.
Yeah. But it's usually the backend you have to be more concerned about. I also used to work in e-commerce, and we had these Black Friday peaks, we had newsletter advertisement peaks, and usually we did performance load testing upfront to ensure we can handle 10 times the normal visitors. And then it's usually the backend that crashes, because if some calculation happens on the front end, it happens in your own browser, but on the backends, the server have the load, and there we need to scale much more.
Cool. We don't have so much more time. I would maybe take one or two more questions. Let's see how long we need to answer. More and more. But let's pick this one here from Pascal. What things in the native or vanilla web implementations or the browser API, let's say, are missing to build on the native platform instead of relying solely on frameworks to orchestrate things? Maybe I pick that one off and then...
you know already where I'm going, so probably we have the same answer.
So... It depends already, because what do you want, right? Because, for instance, if you want to have perfect isolation, you would today say, well, if you need that, use an iframe. So what is stopping you from using iframe? We can't do that isolation. We can isolate styles, for instance, a shadow DOM, but we can't isolate the JavaScript. And for that, we would need, for instance, the realms spec. And that is, we talked about it beforehand. 5 years ago, they said it will come. Maybe in 5 years, it's fully there already. Now we are 5 years away still from it, and maybe in 5 years.
We don't know how long.
I won't give up on it. So I'm optimistic here. But this is, for instance, one thing. Another is, well, on the sharing side, we already have import maps, which are great, but they are still very limited. So you couldn't, for instance, extend them once it's set up, right? So you cannot, for instance, bring in an ESM loaded and then expect it to extend that import map list. So once the first ESM is loaded, the browser then fixes that, and there is no way for you to extend it and build upon it any further. Which is also one of the reasons why in native federation you can't do the cascade so well, because you need to know up front already what's there, because you need to build the import map. It's also the reason native federation carrier script is a normal script and not an ESM already. And so it's little things like that. And quite often, if you follow the spec or the discussions that happen also in the open on GitHub, someone brings up the topic of micro frontends and said, hey, wouldn't it be great to have this? Wouldn't it be great to have a scoped element registry? Wouldn't it be great? And very often the discussion then ends with someone saying, no, we don't see the use case. And I'm like, come on. Maybe then some years later, we see that the scoped registry, it happens. But in general, I think we are getting closer and closer. It's just that on the JavaScript spectrum or the APIs there, it's not moving so fast. CSS, for instance, they made great progress in CSS. I mean, now micro frontends with CSS, they are really doable in my opinion. There's not so much room now for conflicts and everything, with Shadow DOM especially, but there are more and more things coming. And CSS, I feel positive, but JavaScript we are lagging behind. I see I'm nodding, which means
+1 on the registry.
It was an exhaustive answer. So.
But maybe it also just needs a catalog, a better organization. What vanilla APIs do we have to find a set of APIs you can use as a toolbox?
One more thing to add is maybe even if these things exist, maybe you still want to use a framework.
Yeah.
But the reason is not that
Yeah.
a framework could do something you couldn't. It's just maybe gives you already
More
a boost.
convenient,
Because
yeah.
I mean, what React does, for instance, you could also do. What Angular does, you could also do. It's just, you know, they do already so much. And do you really want to reinvent everything that they do?
Yeah.
So with that in mind, we would have more questions, but maybe then for the coffee chat.
Exactly.
It was great having you guys. Enjoy the rest of the cake. I
Thank
see Luca,
You already done,
you
yeah.
still, you need to have now more of that. And with this in mind, we go to the raffles.